And welcome into this edition of the Fighting Saints Report, the final regular season edition, as after next weekend the playoffs will be decided, and next Monday a good chance that you won't be hearing the Fighting Saints Report, actually a guarantee that you won't be hearing the Fighting Saints Report. You'll likely be hearing Fighting Saints playoff hockey next Monday on Super Hits 106 as the Fighting Saints awaiting their first round opponent. And we got two playoff previews this weekend, or possible playoff previews, with Cedar Rapids on Friday and Chicago on Saturday. And the Fighting Saints, in one of their best weekends in a long time, beat Cedar Rapids 4-3 in a tight defensive game on Friday, and then built off that and blew out Chicago 5-0 on Saturday. And as we touched on the broadcast, Jim, this is a weekend that you absolutely can build off of heading into the postseason.
No doubt about it. You look at both of those teams that you played this weekend. You know, Cedar Rapids has had the upper hand in that series all year. Chicago has had the upper hand in the series to date. So it was really important for the Fighting Saints to show they could not only play with those two teams, but they could beat them. You know, I know that the Saints have had games against Cedar Rapids where they've played well in spurts and not won. The same way with Chicago, the games where they've probably deserved to win and didn't. So I think it was really important for their confidence to come out of this weekend with a pair of wins against teams that have been a little frustrating for them this year. And I think that's important moving into the playoffs where, like you said, you could face one of those two teams in the postseason in just under a week or a week from now.
And I think if you're Cedar Rapids and you play Dubuque in the playoffs, you can draw off the fact that you're still 6-3 on the season. I think they'll be able to wipe that from their memory bank pretty easily. If you're Chicago, you can use the fact that Matthew Thiessen just had an outstanding performance on Saturday night and maybe say that's an anomaly. We're a high-scoring offense. We want to have a performance like that again, or we won't run into a goaltender that's able to make 44 saves. Again, it's not likely. But if you're the Fighting Saints, because of the fact that those teams, you know, in the playoffs, it's a completely different animal. The biggest positive for Dubuque probably out of this weekend is they played, just them personally, two really good games, because you're going to wash away the regular season when you get to the playoffs. Those teams aren't going to remember what happened a couple weeks ago, but the Fighting Saints will remember the result and decide that they played two of their very good games, and that's what we've talked about. When you know you're in, you have 2 weeks to focus on you, and I think the Fighting Saints made big strides in the team game that they're playing heading into the playoffs.
Yeah, you know, and I look at like Cedar Rapids in particular. You mentioned Dubuque only won 3 of the 9 games. Well, you know, if you go back and you get a bounce here, you get a bounce there, instead of going 3-6 against them, maybe you go 4-5 or you go 5-4. Then it kind of really changes the complexion. And I think there have been games like that where Dubuque has been, you know, better than the result that they got. So I think that's really important that they had the confidence of beating a team like Cedar Rapids that had frustrated them for so long. And again, you know, if maybe one of those shootout or overtime losses turns into a win, you know, you're 4-5 against them. So, and I think it was really important for Dubuque to, you know, especially a team you're going to possibly play in the playoffs, to get that confidence going and get some momentum going. And I don't think either of the wins this weekend were necessarily flukes. You know, I don't think it was a matter of, you know, just a bad bounce or whatever. Granted, Saturday night's game against Chicago, the Steel really dominated that second period. But, you know, Dubuque was a lot more opportunistic than Chicago was. And I thought, you know, Matthew Thiessen made 44 saves, but I think Dubuque probably had the better of the grade A scoring opportunities. If you add them all up throughout the game, I think Dubuque was, you know, if not, you know, the shots don't always tell the story. I think you got to look at the grade A scoring opportunities, and I think Dubuque had just as many, if not more, than Chicago did. The difference was they were capitalizing on them, and I think that's been an issue throughout the season where the Saints have generated a lot of grade A scoring chances and didn't score on them as much as they should have been.
Yeah, that was a key to Saturday's game. Is through 2 periods at least, the Saints were opportunistic, where Chicago had 31 shots through 2 periods and no goals to show for it. Dubuque only had 15, maybe 16 shots, I believe, and they had 3 goals to show for it. So they were very opportunistic. But you touch on confidence. I don't think anyone's confidence can be higher right now than Matthew Thiessen's. 44 saves, and we did a little bit of digging. Thiessen, the 44 save shutout, is the most saves in a shutout for a Fighting Saints goaltender in Tier 1 history. It's not often you put up 40-plus and hold the opponent to nothing on the scoreboard. And yeah, Dubuque had some good grade A chances, but in that second period, when it was all Chicago, I mean, Thiessen made 2 or 3 saves that you might be seeing on plays of the week later where easily they could have gone into the back of the net, and then you might have a totally different game. I mean, that second period is one where Thiessen probably wins the game for Dubuque right there by keeping Chicago off the board, because quite realistically, if 1 or 2 of those goes in, we're talking 2-1, maybe 3-1 Chicago instead of 3-0 Dubuque.
Yeah, and talking to Matthew after the game, he said a big key was he was seeing pucks a lot better. The guys in front of him did a great job of clearing out Chicago in front of the net, so he could see just about every shot. When that happened, and I think one of the issues that he's kind of had this year is a lot of goals that he's allowed were goals that he didn't see, where there was too much traffic in front, or maybe he wasn't tracking the puck as well. But Saturday night, the guys in front of him did an outstanding job of clearing the front of the zone, front of the net, so he could see all those shots. When that happens, you get a lot of confidence as a goaltender. You're seeing everything. The shooting lanes are crystal clear. You can see them. Then when you do have to make those big, spectacular highlight reel goal or highlight reel saves, you have that confidence that you can make them. And I think that was a really big key for Matthew on Saturday night. And he mentioned that afterwards. As a good goaltender always does, he gives credit to the guys in front of him, and I think that was a huge difference. And he was seeing the puck really well. And when you have guys selling out the way that the Saints did on Saturday night, it makes a big difference. They were making simple plays. They were chipping pucks out when they had to. They were making, they weren't trying to do too much. They weren't. I'm trying to remember how many costly turnovers they had, or how many turnovers at all.
There was one in the second period where Thiessen had to make one of his spectacular saves where it just fell off a Dubuque stick right in the slot, and Neil Shea had 2 grade A chances, and Thiessen stopped both. But you're right, other than that, there probably were maybe one other one, and it wasn't nearly as egregious as that one was.
Yeah, and that's in an area where you really have to get a shot off real quickly. I'm talking about turnovers like in the neutral zone where you can set up a 2-on-1, which is maybe a better scoring opportunity than just a turnover where a guy has to get a shot off real quickly. So I think that was a big area of emphasis for me, or something that I really liked. And like I said, the Saints dumped the puck out of the zone, or they got rid of it, and in a way that is kind of a turnover, but you're prepared for it. You're sitting back, and there's one thing to turn over a puck and not be prepared for it, but there's another to kind of dump it out of the zone and give it to the other team, but be prepared for the counterattack. And I think that was a big key for the Saints. They were really, really good at making sure that they were protecting the puck.
And Thiessen was rewarded for his first USHL shutout, the 44-save effort, goaltender of the week in the USHL this week. He's the second Fighting Saints netminder this season, actually, to get USHL Goalie of the Week honors. Aaron Randazzo had that happen to him a couple months ago, but Thiessen certainly deserving 44 saves. You don't see that every day, especially, let alone 44 saves, but couple that with a shutout. But something I want to touch on before we head to our first break that you pointed out during the broadcast on Saturday, I believe, was another positive sign for the Fighting Saints in that game Saturday is the way they closed it out, because they've had trouble this season closing out games. Even when they've won games, they've let teams back into it, and even though they beat Cedar Rapids on Friday, it was a case where Cedar Rapids got a couple goals late to make that game continuously closer. Liam Walsh scored with about 20 seconds left, and it made the last 20 seconds interesting. It was 4-3. On Saturday, Dubuque had a 3-0 lead after 2 periods, and they built off it. They scored 2 more goals, and after that big push by Chicago in the second period, when we expected more of a push in the third, there really wasn't much. Dubuque made some defensive adjustments and clamped down, and I thought that was one of the best examples of them closing out a game that we've seen all season.
I agree, and I think one of the big areas of closing out that game was we talked about that second period. They go into the second period, it's a 1-0 game, they're ahead. and they're killing off a 5-on-3 penalty right away, right early in the second period, or a carryover from the first period. And, that's a golden opportunity for Chicago to score. Again, Chicago dominated that second period, but Dubuque scored 2 goals. So you take it from a 1-0 lead to a 3-0 lead. I thought that was really deflating. You scored early or they were later in the period, but Chicago dominated that period. You score 2 late goals and make it 3-0, and you could sense in the third period that Chicago didn't have as much push as they did in that second period. That had to be deflating to dominate a period and have nothing to show for it, and actually have 2 goals against. So, it was a 3-0 lead, and I thought Dubuque was much better defensively in the third period to close it out. But I think it did take a little bit out of the wind out of the sails of Chicago by that second period. And again, it's 3-0, and that's with an explosive team like Chicago. There's no question they can score 3 goals in the third period to tie it up. But Dubuque was the team that scored the 2, and I think they did a really nice job of closing it out. And you could sense that Chicago didn't have nearly as much push in that third period as they did in the second.
And not to take anything away from the Fighting Saints, but it did feel like it was probably Chicago's best game of the series, and Dubuque played a similarly good game. And then, whenever you get a 44 save performance from your goaltender, that never hurts. So the Fighting Saints with a win over Cedar Rapids, 4-3 on Friday, and then they build off that. They beat Chicago, their first Saturday win since January 12th, able to go back-to-back against 2 possible first-round opponents. Speaking of the first round, speaking of the playoffs, we're less than or about a week away from the first games. There will be games next Monday, and we'll go through a playoff preview, and somehow we know less than we did last week when we talked to you all about the playoffs. So nothing is really clear-cut. The seeding is still up for grabs. Home ice is still up for grabs for a lot of these teams, and we'll touch on that on the other side of this break. Stay tuned.